tonight we are continuing to look at what we're calling Bible Boot Camp. We looked last week at how we read the Bible as an entire story, and we looked at the story of David and Goliath as an example of how we can read one of the stories in the Old Testament as related to the entire story. And tonight I want to look at how we read the Old Testament laws. How do we read those laws? So hopefully y'all's notes are correct. I printed them off last night, and I hadn't been in the office at all today, so I trust that I gave Gene the right one, so that's all I can say. Those moments happen. So how do we read the Old Testament laws? I never will forget, I had a young man that was a new Christian. He wanted to read the Bible from beginning to end, and he got held up in Leviticus. And he came to me one day and he said, how in the world am I supposed to understand all these laws? All these things about, sacrifices and unclean and clean and, festivals and ceremonies. Why do I need to read any of that? That's a good question, because a lot of times we just ignore those places. We just skip over them and we don't think they're important. But the truth is, every word of Scripture is there because God wants it there for us, and so we need to understand, how do we read these things? How do we read these laws? Particularly the laws that are in the books like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those laws that seem so distant and foreign to us. How do we read them? So tonight I want us to look at that, but before we can discuss particulars of how we read those laws, we have to understand a larger concept. And the foundational principle that God relates to humanity most often through the form of covenants. We don't use that word very often in our language, but it is absolutely vital to understanding how the Bible works. In fact, the word testament is from the Latin testamentum, which means covenant. So the Old Testament is the Old Covenant, the New Testament would be the New Covenant. That's a little bit of an arbitrary terminology perhaps, but it's helpful to us to understand that this is an important concept in the Bible. And you read the Bible, and over again you find examples of covenants. These things called covenants. What are they? How do they operate? Why are they important? We understand that, and we're going to understand how this concept of law functions for us today. So what is a covenant? Well, a covenant is basically, and at its core, it is a chosen relationship in which two parties make binding promises to each other. It's a relationship of choice. It's something that you willingly enter into. You're not forced into it. You willingly enter into this relationship between two parties in which you make promises to each other that are binding on you. In other words, it's an agreement, contract. So when you buy something that requires a signing of a contract, that's a covenant. You are agreeing, so you go buy a car, you sign a contract in which the salesman agrees to give you the car, that's his part of the bargain, in exchange for you giving money in exchange for that. That's a type of a covenant. It's an agreement, it's a contract, in which one party agrees to do something for another party. That's basically all it is. In the Bible, with God, covenants can be conditional, in which the two parties have responsibilities that, if you do this, then I'll do this. If you don't do this, then I'll do this. Or they can be unconditional, where, for instance, God says, covenant with Noah, I'm never going to flood the earth again to destroy all life. We don't have to do anything to keep God, from violating that. He's going to keep His word on that. That's an unconditional covenant. We don't have to do anything on our part. But there are conditional covenants as well. Typically, covenants have various elements to them, and you can spot them in the Bible. Parties to the covenant, who's the people involved. Now, when we talk about covenant, we often talk about God and people. They're not the only types of covenants. You've got examples in the Bible of people making covenants with other people. It's very common in the Old Testament to make covenants with other people or other groups of people. A treaty between two kings would be a type of a covenant that would be made. So you have the parties to the terms, the promises, or the pledges that are made, the things they're going to do for each other as part of that. And then you have the symbol or the sign of the covenant. Something to make the covenant real in the sense that when you see this, experience this, do this, it's a reminder of the covenant. Go back to the covenant with Noah. What's the sign of the covenant with Noah? What does God say is going to be the sign of that covenant? The rainbow. Okay, the rainbow. He said, I'm going to put my bow in the sky. And to think about it, it's kind of a good play on words because it's a bow. You know, those of you who are hunters, think about the fact with a bow, the bow and arrow used to hunt. God said, I'm going to put my bow, the bow of my wrath, in the sky as a reminder that I'm never going to do this again. That's the sign of the covenant. The covenant with Abraham, the sign of the covenant was circumcision. And it was the sign, the symbol of this covenant. And so, not all of those elements are necessary to have a covenant, but they are common enough that we would consider them key elements to covenants, that we would kind of see that as a commonality with covenants. So God relates to humanity most often through covenants. He uses covenants as a means of building relationships with humanity. Very, very important to understand that. Second foundational principle is that God's law is given as part of His covenant with His people. There are at least five, possibly six. There's some debate on the sixth one, whether creation represents a covenant or not. But there's five basically agreed upon divine covenants in the Old Testament. You have the covenant with Noah. That's in Genesis 9 through 11. Or 9, 10, chapter 10. You have the covenant with Abraham. That's in chapters 12, 15, and 17 of Genesis. You have the covenant at Sinai. That's what we're going to look at here in a little bit more detail, beginning in Exodus. The covenant with David. That's in 2 Samuel 7, where God promises David there will be a king on the throne forever. He makes that promise. And then the new covenant, most clearly spelled out in Jeremiah 31, that Jesus then institutes in the Lord's Supper when He says, "This is my blood of the new covenant." So those are the five main covenants in the Old Testament. Each of them serves a different purpose. Okay? The covenant with Noah, the covenant with David, and the new covenant are unconditional covenants. The covenant with Abraham is both conditional and unconditional. The covenant at Sinai is a conditional covenant. And what I mean by that is covenant with David, God says there's going to be a king forever. David doesn't have to do anything to make that happen. Okay, the new covenant, God says this is what I'm going to do. Covenant with Abraham, God says this is what I'm going to do. Abraham's conditional aspect of that is he has to believe God, which he does. Isaac is born, covenant proceeds. That's why that's conditional and unconditional. It's integral to understanding that the biblical story flows along the concept of covenants. So to understand the nature of the law, this thing that's so hard for us to grasp at times, we have to understand that what we most often see as the law, it's not exclusively the law, but the biggest portion of what we would consider the law, is part of the covenant given by God to the people of Israel under Moses. So that covenant at Sinai. So most of what we see when it comes to the Old Testament laws are related to the covenant at Sinai. And that's important because that affects how we read it, how we understand it. We put it in context, it makes all the difference for us. So Exodus 19, 1 through 6 is where this begins. And really, it continues through the rest of the book of Exodus, through the book of Leviticus, and the first part of the book of Numbers is this giving of the law, instructions, rules, guidelines, and the like. Okay? A big chunk of the Old Testament, those first 5 books, is this law. So let's read Exodus 19, 1 through 6. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. And then if you read on, God gives the law. Exodus 20 is the giving of the Ten Commandments. But if you notice some key language there, God says who He is, what He's done for the people to that point. He brought them out of Egypt on eagle's wings. It's a beautiful image. Brought them out of Egypt on eagle's wings, brought you to myself. There's that idea of relationship that's tied into this. And then He says, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. So all of these laws that God is giving to the people are the conditions of His covenant. That if they will obey these laws, then the promise to them is they will be His people forever. A treasured possession amongst all the peoples. Be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. And then you get all these hundreds of laws afterwards. We could spend months looking at these laws, and some of them are kind of fun. I mean, it kind of makes you wonder what life was really like for the people of Israel for these laws to have been written. For God to have seen the need to give these specific laws. They had to have some really crazy things going on. Okay, apparently ox goring was a major problem because there's several laws that talk about, if your ox gores a man and he's not known to have a habit of goring, then you just pay a penalty. If he gores a man and the man dies, the ox dies. If he gores a man and you knew he had the habit of goring, the ox dies and you die. I mean, it's just like, they must have had a really big problem with oxen. Okay? You have these kind of laws, and we read those now, we're like, I don't have an ox. Do I ignore this passage? What's going on here? Is it talking about, if I have a car? I mean, we make all these kind of weird connections. So there's types of laws in the Old Testament. I just want to give you this as kind of an overview for your sake. Some types of laws in the Old Testament. Two big words to impress your friends and family with: apodictic and casuistic. Okay? That'll impress your friends and family next time you're together. Apodictic laws are the laws of the thou shalt and thou shalt nots. Specific commands that seem to be universal. They're not conditioned upon any circumstances. Ten Commandments are good examples of these. Thou shalt not, whatever, of the 10. Okay, or thou shalt. Casuistic laws, or case laws, are the if-then laws, like the ox goring. Your ox gores a man, then do this. And here's all the conditions that could fall under that. I have often believed that casuistic laws should be recalled teenager laws. Okay? Because here's how teenagers work. You tell them something, well, what about this? What about this? And so those are the kind of laws that you have a lot of in the Old Testament. You can read those and see them and just think, man, what were these people going through to need these kind of laws about certain things? And so you have these types of laws, and you have different categories of laws. You have moral laws. These are laws that deal with behaviors, with the heart. Thou shalt not kill. That's a moral law. Okay? Now, you may argue over what involves killing or murder, premeditation, all those kind of detailed things, but the moral aspects of that law are pretty clear. Thou shalt not kill. It deals with something with behavior or with the heart. Ceremonial laws. These are laws dealing with worship, with sacrifice. Bring your grain offering. Bring sacrifices on this day. Bring a sheep without blemish. And all those different laws related. Those are ceremonial laws. And then laws, civil laws. These are laws dealing with the life of the people of Israel. There's a whole section in there about the year of Jubilee and about the Sabbath rest for the land. These are civic laws or civil laws dealing with the life of the people of Israel. And see, because law is found in the context of covenant, this is why it's important for us to understand that concept first. The law then shows us that it is given under the authority of God because God is the king. God gives laws because God can. There's no, court of appeals when it comes to God's law. What God says is okay because God said it. But it's in the context of covenant. It's in the context of relationship. And so it's not just arbitrary. It's not just God being a cosmic killjoy trying to cut off all our fun. It's God building this relationship framed by covenant with His people. This is how His people ought to act. It's kind of like family rules. When you were growing up, I guess you had family rules, right? And your family rules maybe weren't the same as your friends' family rules. And guess what? Your friends didn't have to follow your family rules because why? They weren't in your family. So this is God's family rules. It's how His people ought to act. His people ought to live because God is the King establishing this covenant and we're living under the context of this covenant. So what then is the purpose of the law? Why do we need the law? Why couldn't God just say, love me? Why do we need rules about ox goring and ceremonial uncleanliness and foods to eat? Most of us, if we had to keep kosher, we would put Piggly Wiggly out of business because you can't eat pork or cheeseburgers or shrimp. Okay? It would be pretty serious. So why do we need these laws? Well, fundamentally, there's two reasons. One, to understand what God desires. To understand what it is that God expects of us. God doesn't tell us, how would we know? So we need the law so we know that. But I think even a bigger reason for our sake is to show us that we are sinful. You only need a law when you're a lawbreaker. You don't need laws if you never break the law. You never need rules if you never break the rules. I remember when I was in probably second grade, our teacher started off the year with one rule, and she said, every time y'all break a rule, I'm going to write a new rule. By the end of the first week, we had like 40 rules. And I'm thinking, you should have just gone back and wrote those rules to begin with, because we didn't know we were breaking the rules until we broke them. So God's given us the rules so we know, we broke this rule. Otherwise, we didn't know. So, that's why we need the law. So what do we need to do when we read the laws? And we're going to look at an example here in a little bit, but some questions to ask when it comes to reading the laws. And why I think we desperately need to recover in our personal reading of the Bible, the law. Okay, first, the question is to ask, what does this teach me about God? That's true with any passage of the Bible. The Bible's about God, so what does this teach me about God? But I think there's an important thing the law teaches us about God, and that is that God is holy. In fact, in Leviticus, over and over again, do this, why? Because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So we see that over and over again in the laws. It reminds us that God is holy. But it also shows us that God is concerned with the details of our lives. I think that's an important aspect. Now, I was reading the other day, and it just was one of those things, you read something and it just kind of hits you after a while, and you're like, why in the world is this in here? Okay? And I'm just going to pick an example. Because, I'm going to show you just how God can even use what seems like boring scripture to say something to your heart if you're attentive. Exodus 36. I'm just going to start at verse 8. And all the craftsmen among the workmen made the tabernacle with 10 curtains. They were made with fine twined linen and blue and purple and scarlet yarn, with cherubim skillfully worked. The length of each curtain was 28 cubits, and the breadth of each curtain 4 cubits. All the curtains were the same size. Sounds like a HGTV special. He coupled 5 curtains to one another, and the other 5 curtains he coupled to one another. He made loops of blue on the edge of the outermost curtain of the first set. Likewise, he made them on the edge of the outermost curtain of the second set. He made 50 loops on the one curtain, and he made 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that was in the second set. The loops were opposite one another, and he made 50 clasps of gold and coupled the curtains one to the other with clasps. But the tabernacle was a single whole. And it just goes on and on and on with these details for several chapters. And I was reading that the other morning and thinking, God, I love you. And I come to you every day wanting to hear something from you. And I'm reading Exodus 36. And I know you're not telling me to go out and build a tent. Especially one made out of goat's hair. Because I don't have a goat. Okay? So what's this about? And I got to thinking. And I think this was from God, for my heart at least in that moment, to remind me that God is concerned with the details of life. And so many times we go through life and we think, well, that's just too small of an issue for God to be concerned about. Let me handle it and I'll leave the big stuff to Him. You know, it's kind of like, you know, the difference between major and minor decisions, okay? We sometimes think we handle the little stuff and we'll let God handle the big stuff. Well, God's concerned about the little stuff too, even to the point that He's concerned about the number of rings on the curtains in the tabernacle. He didn't just say make a curtain. He said make a curtain this big with this many rings, this color, this type. I mean, He's that concerned with details. I needed that. I need to be reminded of that because it's easy to forget that God's concerned about the details. So what does this teach us about God? Secondly, what does this teach us about people? What does this teach us about people? Well, one thing it teaches me in a passage like what I just read is sometimes I need God to spell it out real clear, or else I'm not going to do it right. Okay? God doesn't work in IKEA instructions. You ever bought something from IKEA? If you haven't, they don't give you instructions with words. It's just a picture. And it's a box of 1,000,000 pieces and then a picture of what it's supposed to look like when it's done. You know, wouldn't it be something if that's how God dealt with us? He says, here's what your life ought to look like. Figure it out. That's not how God works. God gives us specific things. It tells us that we need specific instructions. But it also reminds me that we need to be taught because we can't figure it out on our own. I mean, what would have happened to the people of Israel if God had said, okay, y'all build a tabernacle, y'all build a tent, do it however you want to. I can tell you exactly what would have happened. The tribe of Judah would have wanted it one way. The tribe of Benjamin would have wanted it another way. The tribe of Ephraim would have wanted it one color. Somebody would have wanted to make sure that their section where they lived had the entrance. I mean, it would have been a disaster. You know why? Because people are sinful. We're selfish. We want what's in it for us. And so as a result, reading those laws reminds me, oh yeah, I'm no worse or better than they were. I'm just like them. I'm exactly like the people of God. You read things like in Exodus where Moses goes up on the mountain and God speaks and Moses says to the people, are you going to obey God? And they say, we will obey Him. And the next thing you know, they've got a golden calf, they're worshiping it. How is that much? We're just like that, are we not? Some days we make commitments to God, and we're lucky if they make it to the parking lot. We're just like the people of Israel. That's why we need to read these passages to show us the nature of our own hearts and that we are sinful. So what does this teach us about God? What does this teach us about people, myself? How does this passage point me to Jesus? How does this passage point me to Jesus? And this is where it gets a little more difficult, but it's possible. Because you see, Jesus came to fulfill the law as the perfect law keeper. You know, we sometimes forget that Jesus' obedience, His ministry, His life in the flesh on this earth wasn't just to be a good example, but was to perfectly fulfill the law. So that when He went to the cross, He wasn't paying for His sins, because there were none to pay for. He was paying for yours. He was paying for mine. And when we see these laws, they need to be a reminder to us of the high price of our salvation. Even things like the tabernacle. The tabernacle is a picture of God's presence on earth, because when the tabernacle was finished and they did it exactly the way God wanted it done, it says the glory descended upon that place. John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Greek word there, dwelt among us, is an idiom, literally means tabernacled with us. God's presence with us, just like it was then, but in a better way, in a more full way. So how does this point us to Jesus? It may take some thinking and some study, but we can get to the cross. When you read the sacrificial laws, the idea that you had to have a lamb without blemish, and then you hear John the Baptist say of Jesus, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Those laws remind us of that. Always remember that the early church, their Bible was the Old Testament. I love the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. You know the story. Philip is called out into the desert. This Ethiopian eunuch is going by. He's reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. And Philip comes up to him and says, do you understand what you're saying? He says, how can I unless someone shows me? And it's in Isaiah 53, that beautiful imagery of the suffering servant. And the text says, starting from there, he shared with him the good news about Jesus. Don't think for a second we need to get rid of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is where we can find the gospel. The early church, that's where they found it. We can find it there too. We just got to remember that it's there and it points to Jesus. Fourthly, how has this law been fulfilled in Jesus? The sacrificial laws point to Jesus' death. So when you see one of those laws, they point to Jesus' death. He fulfilled those in His death. That's why we don't have to sacrifice animals any longer, because Jesus fulfilled. We strive to obey. We seek to obey, but we are justified by our faith, not by our works. So on my best day of obedience, I am no more loved than I am on my worst day. And that makes grace a little messy, because we want to make it, kind of a scoring system. How many points did you earn today? It doesn't work that way. God loves us regardless of our obedience, but we strive to obey because we have been so richly loved. Not to earn His love, but because of His love. The moral laws still apply. They show us what God expects. They remind us of the fact that we are fallen people who don't measure up. They drive us to the cross. They are not what we base our standing before God upon. Okay? And then the fifth question asked is, what's the application for my life? What's the application? And that's different based on the day of the week sometimes. There's one interpretation of a passage, but there's innumerable applications. Okay, the text says what it says, but you can apply it to your circumstances based on where you are at that moment in your life. Does that make sense? Sometimes people have a hard time with that, so I want to make sure you're clear. But the interpretation doesn't change. I got asked one time if I've ever preached the same sermon twice. And here's what I tell people. The research that I do on a passage doesn't change. I may find new sources and that kind of thing and add to it. But the basic research, I can take sermons I researched 10 years ago, take that same research, and I can do a sermon without having to do research, but it'll be a totally different sermon. Because the application has changed based on circumstances. The text still means what it means, but how we apply it may change. So you work through those other questions, and then the application comes from that. The problem we so often have when we read the Bible is we want to have application first thing and forget what it really means. Okay? So let's look at a practical passage tonight. And I picked a good one from, I was going to Leviticus 18, But you can go home and read those. Those are the laws about, anyway, just go home and read Leviticus 18. You'll be glad to talk about that. Leviticus 19, here's what I did. Just based on the best of my understanding of these passages, these verses, the moral laws that apply are in bold. The ceremonial laws that deal with the people of Israel and how they are to live as the people are in italics. And the civic laws that deal with that less ceremonial stuff that's deal with the people of Israel's daily life is underlined. So let's look at Leviticus 19, 1 through 18. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths." That's a moral law. You see that, right? Okay. It's a thou shalt, still applies. Application may differ. We may not apply it the same way that the ancient Israelites applied it, but it still applies. Okay. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. That's a moral law. Okay. And we may not literally be worried about making gods of cast metal, but all of us every day have to ask ourselves, have we put anything else before God? That's idolatry. We put anything before God. Okay? For I am the Lord your God. Now, it gets into a ceremonial / civic law. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it, or on the day after, and anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten all on the third day, it is tainted, it will not be accepted. And everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. So in the middle of this, you have this rule about an offering. Now think about if we were trying to apply that on Sunday mornings. Everybody bring their animal, their grain offering, and we're going to have a cookout. Okay, that's basically kind of what it sounds like, is it not? Here's why I know this is ceremonial, because it says so that you may be accepted. We are not accepted on the basis of our sacrifices. We're accepted on the basis of Jesus' sacrifice for us. So this law has been fulfilled. You don't have to do this one anymore, because Jesus took care of that for us. Okay, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. That's a civic law related to the life of the people of Israel. Now, last time I checked, none of us have a vineyard, right? Okay. I am the Lord your God, it says. Now back to some moral laws. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of the hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, do you see in those verses how the delineation between moral, ceremonial, and civic laws work? Now, what do we glean from this? What's the understanding that we see in these verses? Well, I think we see very clearly God's holiness, because he starts off by saying, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And then he prefaces everything he says by saying, "I am the Lord." This is why you do this, because I'm God. And I'm holy. So the expectation is that God's people live differently because God is different. That's the expectation. Live differently because God is holy. We also see in there a community responsibility. And just think about it. Jesus used Leviticus 19:18, when he said, when he was asked what the greatest commandment was, he quoted from Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19:18. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. If you read, that's kind of a summation of everything in the bold that I've given you before. Then don't take advantage of people. Don't steal from people. Don't lie. Be honest in your dealings. Take care of people. Don't be partial to people. Be fair, equitable, just. Don't hate. There's a community responsibility in that, right? So God's telling the people, live differently. Here's an example of how you live differently. Those things still apply. Those things haven't changed in thousands of years. And then lastly, we see that love, as defined by God, is a defining, guiding moral ethic.